Good morning and welcome to our webinar today. My name is Nancy Larson. I'm the director with the Pollution Prevention Institute, and we want to welcome everyone to this featured presentation, Universal Waste Management. Rebecca Winter from Bureau of Waste Management at KDHE is our featured speaker, and we certainly thank her for being willing to present to us today. This webinar is going to be recorded, and all your lines are muted at this time. And I will continue to mute people as they come online. What we're going to do today is we've got the featured presentation first, and then there is a meeting of the Southeast Kansas Safety and Environmental Network members immediately following the presentation. It will just be a brief meeting. But questions will be taken at the end of Rebecca's presentation, and the way we'd like you to do that is to chat those questions to Barb Good. She is my colleague on the line that's helping me in the background with any technical issues and especially with the questions. And then Barb will ask those questions at the end of Rebecca's presentation. The chat box is located on what we call the dashboard, and your dashboard, if you hover your mouse over near the bottom of the slides, you'll be able to see the dashboard, which allows you to go to the chat function and then just type in your question, sending it directly to Barb. As I mentioned, the Southeast Kansas and Safety and Environmental Network members will stay on after the presentation. This is being sponsored through funding from a grant from USDA. And I just want to make a reminder to folks, any of the industries or companies out there, if you're thinking about having a pollution prevention intern, we did move the application date up, and those applications, which are right online at sbeep.org, they are going to be due on Monday. So if you're thinking about applying or you have a question, you can certainly email me or go right online and fill out the application. Just takes about 15 minutes or so. So again, this presentation is being recorded, and once we have it fully recorded, we'll archive it and put it at our website. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Rebecca. And maybe, Rebecca, if you'd give us a little introduction and then go into your presentations, and I'll just advance the slides for you.
Okay, that'd be great. In introduction, you mean of the material?
Of yourself.
Oh, okay. I'm Rebecca Winter. I'm with the Kansas Department of Health and Environment in the Waste Management Program, as Nancy said, and I am in the Compliance and Enforcement Unit, and generally deal with regulations and regulatory interpretations, things like that. So I know I've probably talked to a lot of you already in the past at conferences or meetings. Today we're going to talk a little bit about universal waste. You can go ahead and advance. And this slide is just a little bit of a regulatory overview. Kansas has basically adopted the federal universal waste regulations. When we updated our regulations in 2011, we reviewed the universal waste regs and decided we hadn't made significant changes previously. We decided not to make any significant changes at that time either. So we basically have just adopted the federal universal waste regulations. So that means that pretty much whatever's in effect at the federal level is in effect in Kansas regarding universal waste. You can go ahead and advance. So there's universal waste is a subset of hazardous waste, and what that means is it has to first be a hazardous waste before it can be a universal waste. So it has to be a solid waste, then it has to be a hazardous waste. Then if it qualifies as a universal waste, you can manage it as a universal waste. That means you've got the option. You can choose to manage it as universal waste, which it's supposed to be beneficial. It's confusing, but it's supposed to be beneficial to generators because there's less record keeping. There's some serious advantages cost-wise to some of these waste streams being managed as universal waste instead of as hazardous waste. But it's if it's too much for you, or you have some other reason you just want to manage it as hazardous waste, that's an option too. You don't have to manage universal waste as universal waste. You can choose to manage it as normal, regular hazardous waste instead. Okay, next slide. There's two types of handlers. Almost all of you are going to be small quantity handlers. It's anybody who accumulates up to 11,000 pounds of universal waste. That's a lot of waste. So most everybody in Kansas, we only have maybe 2 or 3 large quantity handlers of universal waste in the entire state. It just isn't very common to be a large quantity handler. So almost all of you are small quantity handlers, and that's all I'm going to talk about today, because that's the majority of generators or handlers in Kansas. Next slide. There's 4 types of universal waste at the federal level, and that means there's 4 types of universal waste in Kansas. There's batteries, and that includes all types of batteries. So any battery you have, even if it's non-hazardous, if you want to manage it for simplicity's sake, if you want to manage it as universal waste, you can do that. So alkaline batteries don't tend to be a hazardous waste, but we see a lot of facilities managing them as universal waste, because that way they can just manage all their batteries in one place, in one way. So a lot of facilities choose to do that. Pesticides, we don't see very many pesticides managed as universal waste. If you do that, just be aware there are a few exceptions in the regulations for that. So make sure that your pesticides qualify. But we don't see pesticides very commonly as universal waste. Mercury-containing devices, we do see a lot of this. It's any device containing elemental mercury integral to its function, but excluding batteries and lamps, because batteries and lamps are already another type of universal waste. So this is going to be a lot of thermostats, blood pressure equipment from doctors, medical clinics, things like that. So anything that has elemental mercury in it, barometers, lots of different types of things that come out of industrial settings of all types. So if you have something that has a little capsule of mercury in that unit, you can just remove the entire unit and manage the whole thing as universal waste. We don't recommend that you take those apart, because then you're going to have a significant increase to your likelihood of a mercury release, and you don't want that. That's very expensive and very dangerous. So you want to just keep the whole thing intact and manage the whole unit as much as possible, so you don't risk releasing that mercury. And then lamps, that's the most common thing we see. Almost all of you probably have fluorescent bulbs or those big industrial mercury lamps. And so there's different kinds of lamps that fall into this category. I don't know why EPA calls them lamps, but most of us refer to them as bulbs. But you know, it's just that mercury, anything that contains that elemental mercury, or the mercury vapors, things like that. Some lamps you can see the mercury in it, and some you can't. So there's different types of lamps, but whatever kind you have, you can manage under this rule as well. So next slide. So the purpose of universal waste regs, like I said, was to ease the regulatory burden on businesses and to promote recycling. That was the other big thing EPA was trying to do. And so there's a lot of good things about managing your waste as universal waste rather than as hazardous waste. So, and we're going to talk about those. Next slide. So the universal waste regs, the paperwork is significantly lower for if you manage something as a universal waste instead of as a hazardous waste. The big differences are that you don't have to ship it as a hazardous waste. If you're shipping a universal waste to another universal waste handler, you can ship it under a bill of lading rather than under a hazardous waste manifest. And you don't have to use a registered hazardous waste transporter. So there's not a lot of record keeping requirements. You don't have to pay for that expensive hazardous waste transporter to transport the waste. You can actually drive it yourself. Now, you do have to still follow all of the Department of Transportation requirements. We can't exempt you from those. All of those still apply. So if it is a hazardous material by their definition, then you still have to follow their requirements. But what this allows you to do is to take this universal waste, and if you have multiple facilities around one city or even around the state, it allows you to consolidate all of those universal waste into one location, so you can have one big pickup instead of a bunch of smaller pickups. So if you have, let's use 4-foot fluorescent lamps as an example, because those are our most common ones. Say you have, you generate maybe 100 a year at one facility in Kansas City, and in Dodge City you have maybe 50 that you generate each year. So maybe once every 6 months, or once, every 8 months or 9 months, you consolidate those at one of those locations. You just have somebody drive a truck of them, take a pickup and drive it up to the Kansas City, from Dodge City to Kansas City. You consolidate all of those into boxes and ship them out from there. So you're just shipping them one time to a recycler. That's going to probably save you money, lower your costs. And so it's going to be a little bit easier for you that way. Now, the generator is not required to keep a copy of the shipping documents, but obviously it's in your best interest to always know where the stuff is going and to keep records. You're not required to do that, but it's obviously in your best interest to do that. Universal waste can be accumulated for up to a year. That's why I say every 6 months or every 8 or 9 months. You don't want to wait until that 12th month, because let's say you waited till today and there's freezing rain and nobody wants to go out driving hazardous materials out on the road today. So you want to be really careful about that. You don't want to wait until that 12th month and then decide to consolidate. You want to make sure you're giving yourself a little extra time. But you can, if you need the extra time past the year, as long as you are able to demonstrate that you've made an effort to get that stuff recycled, then you can have longer than a year. So it's not as hard and fast as the storage requirements under hazardous waste. This is a lot more flexible this year. It can be as simple as, I've got a box that holds 80 bulbs. I only generated 60 bulbs. I'm waiting till the box is full, because otherwise, obviously, the bulbs in there would break in shipment because they'd be moving around. So I'm going to wait until I generate 20 more bulbs, then I'll ship my box off for recycling. So as long as you document that and keep that record and know that it's going to take you a year and a half, then you're okay. So you get that flexibility. So that's why the record keeping requirements, the flexibility is here. Universal waste is really set up to allow for that flexibility and for that reduced burden on you, the generator, or the handler. We call it handler under universal waste. So that's what it's for, and that's why people choose to manage things as universal waste instead of hazardous waste. Next slide. So the packaging still has to be closed, just like with any other hazardous waste container. For most types of universal waste, this is not really a problem. The problem always comes in with the bulbs. If you have the 4-foot or especially the 8-foot lamps, it's really hard to close those containers. And we recognize that, but it's still required. We cannot give you any kind of waiver or flexibility under a federal rule. So you have to figure out how to store those in a way that you can take the lid on and off to add more bulbs to the box. So think about that when you're deciding where to store these. We've seen people have pretty good luck laying them down if you've got the room, so that bulbs can be slid in, the lid can be slid on and off. If they're standing upright, you really need a ladder for those really tall bulbs. It's pretty hard to get those lids on and off. So you want to think about that a little bit. Most other types of waste that are managed under universal waste are pretty easy to containerize. If it's a self-contained device, such as, let's say, automobile batteries, lead-acid batteries, those are self-contained. You don't need to put them in a separate container to ship them necessarily. They can actually be stacked on a pallet and then shrink wrapped. So that would be an adequate container. You don't have to, you've got a choice. You can either label each individual battery, or you can label the pallet. So it's kind of up to you. You've got some flexibility there. The labeling, the wording on the labels is not flexible. It's in quotes in the regs, and that always means that you have to follow that exactly. So I've listed them here on the slide. This is straight out of the regulations. It either has to be universal waste dash lamp, or waste lamp, or used lamp. It's the same all the way down for each type of waste. So you just have to make sure that you have the exact wording on there. We don't do spell check or anything. We're not that particular, but you do have to have this. You can't just say universal waste. You have to say universal waste lamp. You have to actually say what it is. So that's really important on the labeling. But as far as closed containers, like I say, if it's a self-contained device, you probably wouldn't need to close it. If it's a mercury capsule inside a much bigger device that's sealed up, you wouldn't necessarily have to close that as long as there's no potential for that mercury capsule to be released. But it's always a good idea to close containers whenever possible. So, and you got to think about how you're going to ship a device that's an awkward size or something like that. So you want to think about that a little bit. Next slide. So you must date each container with the earliest date for the waste in that container or on that pallet, as it were. So it's going to depend on when you first started using that container for universal waste. Now, this is where there's additional flexibility under the rule because you can use an alternative tracking system. So you could use a log to show that the universal waste has been on site less than a year. So if you want to keep a log book or some kind of inspection checklist where you have the dates written down when the area was last emptied and the waste was last shipped and how long the waste that's there now has been there, you can use some kind of tracking system like that. So there's a lot of flexibility on that. You obviously have to be able to respond to any kind of a release of universal waste. Most people keep universal waste in their hazardous waste storage area for lots of reasons. For one, you probably have a spill kit in that area. Now, if you are accumulating mercury-containing devices, mercury-containing equipment, you will need a mercury spill kit. So you want to make sure, or you need some kind of a contract or an arrangement with somebody who can do an emergency response for mercury release, because you want to make sure that you can get that contained and cleaned up immediately. So you want to look into that. If you're collecting those kinds of devices, make sure that you have some way of cleaning up. But mercury is the riskiest one, obviously. If you have lead-acid batteries, obviously you're going to need something that can handle corrosives. So you want to make sure that you've got the proper kind of spill control equipment for the type of waste you've got, just like you would with hazardous waste. Then comply with employee training. The employee training here is pretty straightforward. You need to tell them how to properly manage the waste. Obviously, that includes the labeling requirements and keeping containers closed, and then some kind of a tracking system for how long the waste has been on site. And then you need to also train each employee who manages this waste on any emergency procedures. So if they're dealing with mercury-containing devices, they need to be trained on what to do in case of a release of mercury. And that's for their own protection as much as anything else, because mercury is so dangerous. So you want to make sure, obviously, there's physical hazards with all of these, but there's the potential for contamination from all of these types of wastes as well. So you want to make sure that employees are trained on those hazards and that they're familiar with what to do in those cases. Next slide. You also have the option of sending universal waste to another universal waste handler, to a destination facility, or even to a foreign destination. Obviously, if you're shipping it out of the country, you'll have to go through EPA. They don't really like having hazardous materials shipped out of the country, so you'll probably have to do some paperwork there. We don't deal with that, EPA would. I don't know that there's a whole lot of paperwork with it since there's no manifest. You're not actually shipping a hazardous waste, but you want to verify that depending on what state you're going through to leave the country. Now, as far as going to another handler, like I say, you can consolidate this at any of your facilities. You can even consolidate this at other community facilities. It doesn't have to be somebody that's owned or operated by you. So we allow hazardous waste generators to use our household hazardous waste facilities for universal waste if they want to. Some of the household hazardous waste facilities like it because they can charge you for that, and then that helps pay for their disposal of universal waste from complex fluorescent bulbs, things like that that they get from the community. By collecting fees from you, it helps them build that capacity within their own facilities so they can offer that service to just regular citizens too and not add to their expenses. So some of them really like having universal waste coming from businesses because, like I say, they can charge you a small fee for that. It's still going to be cheaper for you. It gets recycled. It's kind of a win for everybody. Some don't have the capacity. They just don't have the storage room. They don't want to mess with it. There's lots of good reasons. Some of them aren't allowed to charge fees for various local reasons, so they don't want to deal with it. So you need to check with your household hazardous waste facility. But if you only generate a few bulbs each year or just a small number of batteries, you might check with them, see if you can work something out with them to be able to take that universal waste to them. Like I say, maybe work out a fee system so that they can offer a better service to their other clients as well. And then again, you may accumulate universal waste for up to 1 year. And this is where the flexibility is really good too, because it gives you the option to manage that for longer than a year if you need to. You just have to be able to demonstrate why. You have to have a reason why. You can't just keep it indefinitely because you don't want to pay for somebody to recycle it. You have to have a reason. It can be as simple, like I said, as I need to fill the box up before I ship it or it wouldn't be safe. That's a good reason. So it's really flexible, but you do need to document how long it's been there, and if it's been there longer than a year, what you're waiting on, why aren't you shipping that to somebody to get it recycled. Next slide. You must send it to another universal waste handler. Nope, wait, that's the same slide. Okay, good. So then this is my contact information. And I'm supposed to talk about also common violations with universal waste and also hazardous waste. Universal waste, we don't see a lot of violations. Usually it is for the not closing containers. That's the most common one. And occasionally labeling, but really it's the most common one for universal waste is always going to be that open container. It's just so hard to close those containers of bulbs, but it's very important because you don't want to have a release of that mercury or whatever the other hazards might be. You don't want that stuff released into your facilities. You need to make sure you keep those closed. Hazardous waste, the most common violations also are container management, always container management. You've got to label hazardous waste containers with the words hazardous waste. They have to be kept closed. You need to know the difference between a satellite container and a storage container so you know what other requirements apply to that container. So those are the most common things we see. Also paperwork, it's always paperwork, which is a nice thing about universal waste, there's a lot less paperwork. We still see a lot of training violations where people aren't being trained every year. You've got to do hazardous waste training and universal waste training. You want to make sure that your employees are current and understand any changes you might have made to your systems, your processes, you know, your waste generation, your waste storage areas. You know, that's why it's required every year. You want to make sure that your employees are current. They know where you store everything, where do they get new containers, new labels. You know, have there been any changes to the regs? You want to keep them current on everything. So those are the most common things we see with hazardous waste stuff is always container management and then a few record keeping things. Generally speaking, everybody's doing a pretty good job across the state with the big stuff. We still see a few things that our enforcement cases have been pretty steady. We still see a little bit of unlawful disposal of hazardous waste, usually because the generator didn't realize it was hazardous. And that always comes back to the single most common problem, which is not doing an accurate waste determination or failing to do any waste determination at all on particular waste streams. So you want to make sure that the waste determinations are accurate. You want to make sure that that paperwork is always up to date, that you know that you have a piece of paper documenting your waste determination for each and every waste stream at your facility so that you know how that waste is supposed to be managed. Because if you don't have that, if you don't know how that waste is supposed to be managed, you will have other violations on down the road because you aren't going to manage it correctly. So you want to make sure that those waste determinations are accurate. You're not required to review them every year, but it's never a bad idea, at least every couple years, every 3 years, every 5 years, to go through them, make sure that you aren't missing any, that you haven't started any new processes and failed to make any determinations on any waste that are coming off those processes. Sometimes your manufacturing section may go in and tweak a few processes, and now they have a new waste stream. So you want to make sure that you're keeping those waste determinations up to date, that you've got waste determinations on all your waste streams. Those are the most common violations for hazardous waste. And I guess I am ready for questions if there's any questions on any of that.
Great, thank you so much, Rebecca. That was a great overview of the rule and of the common hazardous waste violations. Barb, do you have any questions chatted?
I do have one, and just for the folks who came on late, just a reminder that if you take your cursor and put it below the slides, a dashboard will show up, and if you have a question, you can hit the chat button and chat the question either to me or to everyone. But there is a question, is a wet cell battery and a lead acid battery the same thing?
I don't know. I don't know that much about batteries. It sounds like it would be the same thing. I mean, any battery can be regulated or can be managed under the universal waste regulations. So if it's a battery, if it meets the definition of a battery, and there is actually a definition in the waste regs, if it meets that definition, it can be managed as a universal waste. I don't know what a wet cell battery is. I would imagine it's some kind of acid battery, though.
Rebecca, I had the advantage of getting to Google while you're talking, and so
Okay.
dictionary.com says an electric cell in which the chemicals producing the current are in the form of a liquid rather than in the form of a paste. And it says in parentheses, as in a dry cell, car batteries consist of a series of wet cells. And
okay, so it sounds like then it's just like a car battery would be one example of a wet cell, but a wet cell is not necessarily a car battery.
But I think maybe the point is it does look like it still has lead, and actually, I guess I saw a picture that's had lead. I didn't notice if it had acid. So it's probably still a hazardous waste that could be managed as a universal waste.
Yeah, probably. And like I say, even if something doesn't meet the definition of a hazardous waste, like an alkaline battery, you can choose to manage it as a universal waste. The only thing you got to watch out for if you do that is you don't get to say, well, we're going to manage all of our batteries as universal waste, and then when you get a violation because you had an open container of batteries, go, oh, well, none of those are hazardous. At that point, it's already a violation. You're getting your universal waste violation because you chose to manage it that way. So we're not going to go through the 55-gallon drum and figure out which ones are alkaline batteries and which ones are other kinds of batteries. So just be aware of that. We're not digging through your waste.
Okay, and then another question is, will you explain the difference between universal waste and special waste, the main difference? And then they also want to know where you can get the best information on special waste permitting.
Okay, yeah, universal waste is a hazardous waste, and it's in the hazardous waste regulations. Special waste is a solid waste. It is not a hazardous waste. So it is in the solid waste regulations. Special waste can go to a municipal solid waste landfill in Kansas, and it's going to be any kind of industrial waste that requires special handling at the landfill. So maybe it's something that's coming in a 55-gallon drum, which always freaks out landfill operators, or it's something that is like a really fine powder. Maybe it's an inhalation hazard for the people at the landfill, but it's not necessarily a hazardous waste. It doesn't have any hazardous constituents, but on there it says don't breathe this stuff in. Well, you don't want to send that to the landfill in a big quantity. They need to know that that's coming in so they can make a hole for it, pour it in, put some other waste over it, and then compact so it's not blowing up in their face and they're not breathing it in. So that would be an example of a special waste. It's not hazardous. It's not poisonous in any way. It's not going to meet the definition of a hazardous waste, but it's still dangerous for the landfill employees. So that would be a special waste in that case. It can still go to a regular municipal landfill. It just is going to require some special handling for the landfill operators. A universal waste is going to have to be a hazardous waste first, and in fact has to be one of those 4 categories. So it's got to be batteries, pesticides, lamps, or mercury-containing devices. Hopefully that answered the question. If not, ask me another one.
And then I sent a link to everyone of the location of the special waste disposal request form. And
that was the other part of the question, sorry.
Oh, and then if folks go to your website, that form is, the link to it is also listed on the right side of their website under waste management links. And then another question, is it a dust, let's see, wait a minute. Oh, about that special waste, it's a dust in 55-gallon drums.
And I would say if you have anything in a 55-gallon drum that you want to take to a landfill in Kansas, you should probably get a special waste authorization for it, or at least talk to the landfill ahead of time, because they don't take stuff in drums normally, and they shouldn't take stuff in drums, because normally hazardous waste goes in drums. And it's okay to use drums for non-hazardous waste, but it should freak them out a little bit, and hopefully they would be calling us. So if you have the special waste authorization, then they know that they're going to be receiving this stuff. They know that it's non-hazardous, and you shouldn't have that hassle at the landfill. So that's what the special waste authorization is for. That's what special waste is for, is just so that there's an understanding between you and us and the landfill that this stuff is non-hazardous, but it does require some special handling on their end. It's going to come in a special container. There's something unusual about it. So, you know, that's what it's for. It's just an industrial waste that requires some special handling. So that hopefully, and it's not a permit. You don't have to have a permit. It's just an authorization, but there is an application form. And then Tony Guy is our special waste coordinator, and he then looks at that, makes sure it's non-hazardous, and then issues the authorization to you or your contractor.
I don't think there's any other questions that was chatted.
Okay, great. I have just a couple of questions, and one is, I did just pull up the special waste disposal request. Can you see that on the screen, Barb?
Yes.
Okay, great. It came up in kind of big font. I wasn't sure if that would show up, and I'll just thanks for linking that, Barb, for everyone. And basically, it is a very simple form. Page 2 are the instructions. And Rebecca, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but typically an industry makes this request, and that request is generally good for a full calendar year. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, it's either for a year. They'll say how long it's going to be for on there. There'll be an expiration date. Sometimes it's more the amount, like they'll exceed the amount, and then you've got to increase the amount on there. So it's both. It's a time frame, but it's also a quantity of waste.
Okay, good. And I know this isn't a special waste discussion here today, but one example, I wondered if this was another example. Folks who have paint filters that are not toxic, so they pass TCLP for all the metals and the toxics, and they're no longer ignitable, but they still may be combustible. And so sometimes they'll put those in the 55-gallon drums, or they may have them in a Gaylord or something like that. And that may be another example of special waste.
Yeah, that would be another good example. Or even rags, whether it's paint filters or rags, wipes, solvent contaminated wipes, something that's non-hazardous but can go to the landfill. But, you know, maybe there's a history of a transfer truck catching on fire because of your waste, or you're just worried about it happening. You've had a dumpster fire before, you know, whatever your reasons are. If you have something like that you're just a little bit concerned about, but it's not technically a hazardous waste, then I would go through the special waste authorization process, because you're going to be taking it directly to the landfill, and they need to be aware of that, because if it's caused a problem in a dumpster, it could cause a problem in their landfill, and they need to be made aware of that problem. So that, because a landfill fire, your dumpster fire might last an hour, a landfill fire can last years. So we don't want our landfills catching on fire. You need to make sure that if you're sending anything that's potentially combustible to them, they know about it ahead of time.
Good, good. Thank you for that. Okay, two other things that I wanted to talk about. One is alkaline batteries. It's my understanding that over a decade ago, they used to contain, or some of them, that especially if they were made in other countries outside the U.S., contain some mercury or some other metals. But it's my understanding that all alkaline batteries, like you said earlier, are not hazardous waste. They can go to the trash unless the generator chooses to handle them as universal waste.
That's true. That's true. We don't have any reason to believe they're hazardous anymore. We don't make people do a waste determination on every alkaline battery from different, manufacturers, just because generally they're not hazardous. But if you want to recycle them, obviously that's the best choice. The easiest way to do that is managing them as universal waste.
Sure, and I'm not sure what they pull out to recycle anymore. I do know that some of the facilities have chosen just to, throw them away, even though someone brought them to be recycled, like the HHWs, because the expense of sending them off that way is more than, say, the HHW can afford.
And that may be true. I don't know the answer to that.
Okay. All right. And then how about, we have some battery outlets, some battery sales facilities, Walmart, I understand, in some cases will take the used batteries, so the NiCads, the lead acid, some of the lithiums, and there's no problem for a generator to bring their, a handler, I should say, to bring their universal waste there. They just have to document it. Is that correct?
Yeah, and they don't even have to document it. It's just a good idea. They're not required to maintain documentation, but obviously it's in their best interest to maintain documentation. Now, some of those places don't want to take it from businesses. Like Home Depot will take compact fluorescent lamps from a homeowner. As a resident, I can take them, my compact fluorescent lamp, to Home Depot and they'll recycle it for me. But and Walmart will too, but they don't want to take them from, the Subway sandwich shop across the street. They don't want to take their compact fluorescent bulbs because they're a business. So some of those places will take them, but they won't take them from businesses. So you got to be aware of that. I would check with them before you just take your waste over there and make sure that they will accept them.
Okay, good. All right. Any other questions, Barb?
No. No more.
Okay, great. I don't see any either. And so, Rebecca, I want to thank you so much for joining us today and putting this presentation together. We really appreciate it. So thank you very much.
No problem. Thanks for having me, and I will get off the call and let you have your meeting.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.